Hello and welcome back to the Consistory of the Coelc YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Zabel of St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. Welcome back to our mini-series Ask the Consistory, where we answer listener questions. So in today's video, I was asked the question as to why do Christians not worship on the Sabbath? Why do we not follow the Sabbath requirements? And so, in order to understand this, we need to look at the three different types of Christian views regarding the Sabbath and the Sabbath laws. There are, of course, the Sabbatarians, those such as the Seventh-day Adventists, who teach that Christians are still bound by the Sabbath law and that we are to rest from all labor on Saturday, and that we should only worship God on the Saturday. There is also the New Sabbatarians, or the Sunday Sabbatarians. These are groups such as Roman Catholics, the Reformed, and some Eastern Orthodox, as there is not a consistent belief regarding the Sabbath within Eastern Orthodoxy. The New Sabbatarians teach that the command to do no work on the Sabbath still applies to us Christians, but that the Sabbath day has simply been changed from Saturday to Sunday. Now, the Westminster Confession, so this would be the Reformed Confession, Chapter 21, line 7 reads, "As it is the law of nature that in general a due proportion of time be set apart for the worship of God, so in his word by a positive moral and perpetual commandment binding all men in all ages, he has particularly appointed one day in 7 for a Sabbath, to be kept holy unto him, which from the beginning of the world to the resurrection of Christ was the last day of the week, and from the resurrection of Christ was changed into the first day of the week, which in Scripture is called the Lord's Day, and that is to be continued to the end of the world as the Christian Sabbath." The Catholic Catechism also teaches that Sunday is the Christian Sabbath, stating that Sunday worship fulfills the moral command of the Old Covenant. The Roman Catholics teach that it was the apostles themselves that changed the Sabbath day from Saturday to Sunday, and that this thus then gives proof that the Church has authority to implement new canonical laws. There is, however, a third group which is known as the non-Sabbatarians, and this is where we Lutherans fall in, and we are also joined by some Eastern Orthodox, for as I mentioned, there is not a consistency among the Eastern Orthodox on the question of the Sabbath. Some are New Sabbatarians and some are non-Sabbatarians. Now, non-Sabbatarians believe that the commandment to rest on Saturday was part of the ceremonial law of the Old Testament given to the Israelites, and that the third commandment does not command us to observe any particular day, but instead it commands us to set aside a day and a time to worship God. Many church fathers instructed Christians to worship on Sunday, but they did not teach that Sunday was a new Sabbath. Eusebius of Caesarea is one of the earliest to teach that the Sabbath had been transferred to Sunday, and he lived from 260 to 340 AD. But Justin Martyr, who lived from 100 to 165 AD, had earlier stated that the third commandment did not apply in a binding fashion to Christians, but that Christians were free to worship on either Saturday or Sunday or on both. The 29th canon of the Council of Laodicea from 363 AD said, "Christians must not Judaize by resting on the Sabbath, but must work on that day, rather honoring the Lord's Day, and if they can, resting then as Christians. But if any shall be found to be Judaizers, let them be anathema from Christ." Thus here the council instructing Christians to honor Sunday, as this is the day that Christ rose from the dead, but they did not command that Christians needed to rest on Sunday. Instead stated that if they can rest, then they should. Anyone who sought to enforce Sabbath rest on either Saturday or Sunday was condemned by the council as a Judaizer. In the Augsburg Confession, Article 28, Melanchthon rejects the Roman Catholic belief that the Sabbath was transferred from Saturday to Sunday. Melanchthon rejects that the Church has any power to do so. He says that there are faulty debates regarding the changing of the Sabbath. He calls it an erroneous opinion that the Old Testament Sabbath requirements still apply to us Christians, but have simply been changed from Saturday to Sunday. See, the non-Sabbatarian argument is based on several points. The first of these points is that in Colossians chapter 2 verses 16 and 17, it says that no one is to judge us according to our keeping of the Sabbath, for the Sabbath requirements were merely a shadow of Christ's incarnation, death, and resurrection. Deuteronomy 5:15 states that the reason the Israelites kept Saturday as holy was because it was on that day that God liberated the Hebrews from Egypt. This liberation from Egypt is a foreshadowing of how Christ liberated us from sin, death, and the devil. It is for this reason that many new Sabbatarians argue for a Sunday Sabbath, since it is on Saturday that the Israelites were liberated and on Sunday that the Christians were liberated. But this is ignoring Paul's overall point to the Colossians that no one is to be judged based on Sabbath observance. In Galatians 4:10, Paul criticizes the Judaizers for observing particular days, months, seasons, and years. Now, the second argument for non-Sabbatarianism is that man does not possess the authority to alter God's law. Hebrews 8:13 says that the old covenant is no more, and as Christ told his disciples on the night when he was betrayed, we are now under the new covenant. For this reason, Christians are not bound to follow the ceremonial laws of the Old Covenant, nor are we to follow the civil laws of the nation of Israel and Judah. Instead, we are only bound to follow the moral laws, which themselves are founded upon the natural law. For the ceremonial laws were given only to the Old Testament Israelites to mark them as God's chosen people from which the Messiah would come. But the moral laws, that is, do not kill, do not steal, do not commit adultery, these were built into the creation and were given not just to the Jewish people, but to both Jews and Gentile believers and unbelievers. Therefore, if the Sabbath requirements were part of the ceremonial law, they no longer applied to Christians. But if they were part of the moral law, then they are built in the creation and they apply not only to Christians, but to all people. Both the Sabbatarians and the new Sabbatarians teach that the Sabbath requirements are part of the moral law of God. But if this were the case, then they must be written into the natural law and built into the creation. Therefore, if they were built into God's natural law, they cannot be altered by us humans. Regardless of whether the apostles or a church council has decreed, man does not possess the authority to change the moral and natural law of God. The church has no more authority to change the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday than we have the ability to change the command not to murder. Therefore, if the Sabbath observance was part of the moral law of God, then the Sabbatarians would be right that we need to continue Saturday worship. Thus, the new Sabbatarians are wrong when they argue that the Sabbath requirements are part of the moral law of God. This then leads to the third argument, and that is that the Sabbath day observances are part of the ceremonial law and not part of the moral or natural law of God. And therefore, since they are part of the ceremonial laws, then they no longer apply to the Christian. As the Augsburg Confession says, Holy Scripture did away with the Sabbath, and it teaches that after the revelation of the gospel, all ceremonies of the old law may be given up. Luther said in the Large Catechism, according to its own outward meaning, this commandment does not concern us Christians. It is entirely external matter, like the other regulations of the Old Testament associated with particular customs, persons, times, and places, from all of which we are now set free through Christ. And in Luther's 1525 against the heavenly prophets in matters of images and sacraments, Luther wrote, Moses' legislation about images and the Sabbath, and what else goes beyond the natural law, since it is not supported by the natural law, is free, null and void, and is specifically given to the Jewish people alone. the Sabbath observance is not part of the natural law, but was given to the Israelites alone. Now, many will object and say that in Exodus 20, it cites the creation week as evidence for the Sabbath day. And in Genesis 2, God rested on the seventh day and made it holy. Thus, how can Luther argue that it is not part of the natural law? Well, such an argument is reasonable since Exodus 20 does reference Genesis 2 regarding the third commandment. However, there is a difference between the creation being used as an example and something belonging to the natural law. For example, in 1 Corinthians 11, 7-9, Paul argues that in the church, men should have their heads uncovered and women should have their heads covered. And Paul's reasoning for this is that in Genesis, God made man first and that woman was made as man's helper. Also, in verses 14 and 15, Paul references nature as evidence that men should have short hair and women should have long hair. Here, St. Paul is referencing the natural order of things and the creation of mankind to support his view on the practice of head coverings. However, if the referencing of creation was equal to the natural law, then this would mean that the head coverings and the length of hair are part of God's moral law, rather than an apostolic custom, which we know cannot be the case, since in the Old Testament, both men and women had to cover their heads during worship. Thus, men having uncovered heads cannot be part of the natural law. Plus, in the Old Testament, the Nazarites, such as Samson, were not only allowed to, but commanded to grow their hair long. But if hair length was part of the natural law, then the Nazarites would be contradicting natural law. Thus, we can see from this that the referencing of creation is not equal to something belonging to the natural law. Secondly, a key feature of the natural law and of the moral law is its application to all people, from the beginning of the world to the end of the world. Hence, why the church does not have the authority to change the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday if it belonged to the natural law. See, the natural law is something that God built into the creation, and it applies naturally to all people, Jews and Gentiles, believers and unbelievers. The unbeliever may not accept God's law, but they are still bound by it, and God will punish them for breaking it. Now, the Sabbath was not given to all people. Prior to the giving of the Mosaic law, none of the patriarchs in Genesis are ever said to observe the seventh day rest from work. Now, Sabbatarians will argue that they did observe this rest, it just wasn't explicitly mentioned until Moses had the revealed law, such as it doesn't say that stealing was wrong in Genesis, but we do know that stealing is wrong. But in Exodus 31, 16-17, God explicitly says to the Israelites that the people of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, and that this is his covenant with them forever. The commandment is given only to the nation of Israel, and not to any other nation. The natural law is for all people, not just Israelites. As Luther said in his Against the Heavenly Prophets in matters of images and sacraments, common natural laws such as honor parents, not to kill, not to commit adultery, to serve God, etc., prevail and remain in all lands. And so, as we can see, the keeping of the Sabbath, either on Saturday or on Sunday, is not part of the natural law, and thus it is not part of the moral law. It is instead part of the ceremonial law of the Jews and has been abolished by the death and the resurrection of Christ. We Christians are no longer under the old covenant. We do not have to obey the kosher laws, we do not have to be circumcised, and we do not have to keep the Sabbath requirements. They are all part of the old covenant, of the ceremonial and civil laws of the Jews and the nations of Israel. They do not apply to the Christian, and therefore we are free to work on Saturday or Sunday. However, there is some requirement in the commandment that we should set aside some time to rest from our labor in order to worship God. And that is how Luther in the Catechism interprets the application of the third commandment to the Christian, that it does not require a rest from work on a particular day of the week, but that the third commandment does require of us Christians to set aside some time every day and every week in order to worship God. And so no, Christians are not bound to have to obey the Sabbath requirements. We are not bound to worship on the Sabbath day, and we are not bound to abstain from work on the Sabbath day. We are free to worship. Although, as the Council of Laodicea said, if you can cease from labor on Sunday, you should. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye, and God bless.